When people in their 50s, in their very early 60s, lose their jobs, it just takes them a long time to find another one. And that's, when you look at employer surveys, employers say that they value older workers' experience and their maturity, but they also say that they're concerned about the fact that their healthcare costs might be more expensive, their wages are higher, that it's more expensive to hire a new older worker rather than a new younger worker. So it's cheaper to hire a younger person than an older person. If you actually look at the data, you look at the healthcare costs, they are a little bit higher for people in their 50s, but they're not dramatically higher than relative, let's say, to someone in their 30s. People in their 30s have children, and so childbirth expenses are very high. That's something that a 50-year-old woman is not going to experience. So there are some offsets in terms of really how much more expensive is it to hire a 55-year-old than a 35-year-old. But because wages tend to increase over time, wages are a little bit higher on average for people in their 50s than people in their 30s, though again it's not dramatically different. And so it's sometimes perhaps unclear why employers seem somewhat reluctant to hire older people. Part of it could be simply because they're worried that they're not going to be with the employer as long as a 30-year-old. So a 55-year-old is not going to be with this employer for 20 years probably. A 35-year-old might. Again, unlikely that a 35-year-old these days is going to be with that employer for 20 years. Employers also express concern that, well, maybe older people haven't kept up with the latest technological skills, so they might not have the skills that the employer is looking for. And so we do see that older workers are less likely to get employer-provided training than younger workers. And again, that could be because of this concern that they're just not going to be around long enough to make that investment worthwhile.
I think there's a story among employers too. I don't think, for the most part, employers have caught up to the demographics as well. Until very recently, employers still had many early retirement plans, even as the number of young people coming into the workforce were not in sufficient numbers to really meet their demand for employment. And so they've had in place a number of structures that I think have impeded hiring older workers. I think some of their seniority pay scales have also encouraged them to get rid of older workers. It may be at age 55 or 58, maybe we're not quite as productive as we were at 45, but generally speaking, we don't have pay scales that actually fall as our productivity falls off. In some sense, we've sort of had this pattern of retirement in the United States that I think still dominates, but is sort of a funny one if you think of it, which is sort of that we're sort of like what are sometimes called one-hoss shays. The notion is you rode in this one-hoss shay and then one day it would just fall apart and you went and you bought a new one. Well, we sort of treat workers the same way, like they're fully capable of working, and then one day, boom, they can't work at all. I mean, that's what retirement has often meant in the United States. Is retirement? We still think retirement means you drop out of the labor force altogether, which is, if you think about it historically, is a little silly. When you worked on the farm and you were older, not that most people made it to old age in those days, but if you did what you could. Maybe you didn't go out and cut the wheat, but you slopped the pigs or whatever. But you still participated in the working of the farm. So this notion that workers are like one-hoss shays is a little bit of, if you think about it, a little bit of a silly notion. And I think it mainly comes out of the industrial age, when it's probably true that at some point you just couldn't work in the factory anymore, and therefore you just needed to retire. But although it's a misleading metaphor, I still think it dominates employment. I think from the employee side, there's something else that goes on too for older workers, and that is simply that older workers are much more likely to conclude that it's not worth the effort to make some of the efforts that younger workers would do. So for instance, to move to a different city in pursuit of employment. If you're younger, you might think, well, I go to a different city, I can make it, and maybe it'll take me 5 years to get started, but 10, 15 years from now, I'll be in good shape. If you're 50, 55, 60, you might be thinking about retiring in 5 years anyway, so making a move to take a chance for the next 5 years on finding something is just often not as worthwhile. So if you're in a declining region or a declining city in America, this is a particular problem, because jobs are really being lost there much more so than, say, in some of the more booming areas. And in fact, you'll find that these employment patterns that you're examining really vary quite widely by region, and they're not nearly as severe in areas with rising employment, and they're much more severe in areas with falling employment. But again, think about it, in the areas with falling employment, it's the younger workers who are leaving and the older workers who are staying behind. So for instance, you have a state like West Virginia that, unbeknownst to a lot of people, have, at least at one point maybe still, has the oldest population in the United States, and that's because the younger families are moving out. The younger people moving out and the older families are staying there. The younger families moving out reduces demand, and therefore that just exacerbates this cycle where the older workers can't find a job and decide, why do I want to move now?